It is so good to be with you guys today. Everybody have a good spring break this past week? Yeah. If I don't know you guys, I haven't had the chance to meet you guys. Maybe it's your first time here. My name is JD. I'm the Crosstalk pastor here with Cypress Creek Church. We are so glad that you guys are here. Every time we have the chance to be on campus is something special, just because we don't get to do it all the time. And most of us probably didn't even have to drive to get here, which is always a gift. I know we had a whole bunch of people went to Arkansas, several groups, Arkansas for spring break. Anybody else make it farther than Arkansas? Work? Seattle, Mississippi, okay. I know we also, is Mark here? I know he was in Yosemite, so he was out in California, but Washington may be the farthest that anybody got to travel. Did they drive? No. You definitely drove the farthest. Yeah, that's for certain. Taylor and I got lucky enough, we got to go out. We've got some friends in Utah, and so we went out and we went skiing for the weekend. We did not drive, for sure. That is a miserable 20 hours in the car. But we went out to Utah. We skied for 2 days out there, stayed in a little mountain town called Eden. And Eden puts you within like a half hour of two kind of major places to go ski in Utah, and the first one is Powder Mountain, and the other is Snow Basin. In Snow Basin, we skied one day, and we got super lucky. The night before we went, it snowed like 14 inches up there. So there's all of this fresh powder, and so we get up early, we're skiing out there, and it is just gorgeous. It is 30 degrees and sunny, just about as good as you can get if you're going spring skiing. And so we, knowing we're only going to be there one day, we ski as hard as we can all day. And this is a huge mountain, and so we're trying to hit a little bit of everything. And so we get to the afternoon, and we go from kind of the main section of the mountain where you can work your way over to this far side. And over on this far side is like a whole different set of runs. And they're super beautiful. People don't go over there, so we're skiing by ourselves. We're having this awesome experience, and we get down to the bottom of the gondola, and we're hopping on, and the guy before the doors close, he goes, "Hey, just so you know, we're shutting this lift down early. And so when you guys get up there, if you don't make it back to the main part of the mountain, you are going to have to hike in your ski boots all the way out of here." So like, oh my gosh, wait, what in the world? Like, this sounds awful. So now it's the stress of I'm in a new place and I'm trying to find my way. It's like getting lost in the grocery store as a young kid. You're like, how do I get home? Where is the exit? And so we're up there, we're stressed about getting out and not having to hike out. And by the time we get, this gondola is at like 2,000 feet of elevation. And so it's nice and it's sunny down low. And then we get up to the top and it is snowing harder than I have been in a snowstorm in a long time. Like, it is absolutely whiteout conditions. Like, from me to Johnny, I can't see that far. And so it's snowing like crazy. We know we have to get off of the mountain. And so we start skiing, and there are these things called cat tracks. And these cat tracks are basically like, from the second row up to the mics wide. And they're a way for the snow cats to come up the mountain every night, and they groom the mountain. And generally for us as skiers, if you guys go skiing, it's a way for you to transition from one area to the next. So they're really mellow, and they're not very steep, and so it's super easy skiing. Like, if you've never been skiing, that is a great place to learn, is you ski these cat tracks, and it's a nice, easy way down. Well, I can't see anything, and I'm just following. There are little signs that are like as big as this mic stand around, and you're just like hoping that you see one. And I'm leading the group. It's me, my dad, and a family friend of ours. And we're skiing, and I'm like, well, crap, I can't see anything. I just keep skiing, and I think I'm on the cat track. And then all of a sudden, I just fell off of an edge. I literally never saw it. And so it was exactly like Wile E. Coyote when he was chasing Roadrunner, and he runs off the edge of the cliff, and his legs are still going. He looks down and falls. That's what I felt like. It was like, there's nothing underneath me, and then I just fell and hit the ground. Like, stood up, and I'm in waist-deep snow, and I'm like, well, what do I do now? It's real embarrassing because I got to take my skis off, got to hike back up. Still no one can see anything. My dad's laughing at me, which is always a lovely experience. And so I hike my butt up there, and we go on and we keep skiing, and it works out totally fine. But there's something kind of unique about cat tracks and skiing. Generally, because they are these transition areas, when you go from one to the next, you'll get to the run that you want to ski. And there's this moment when you're on top of that edge on the cat track, and it's almost always the steepest part is that little drop-in to get to where you're going. And so you go and you put your skis over the edge and you're like, well, if I go, then I'm going. Like, I can't back out. Once I go over this edge, I'm in it until I figure it out. And so you kind of do all of this risk assessment and you say, well, do I actually want to go off of the edge right here? And then you just kind of have to commit and turn your skis downhill and go. And any of you guys maybe who like grew up skiing, or maybe you grew up riding a skateboard, or you tried a skateboard once and fell real hard, it was probably because of this. You go to like the mini ramp, and then the moment you drop in, it's terrifying because it seems to go straight down. Maybe even just like bombed a hill as a kid on your bike, and you got going and then you realize I can't stop anymore, and so you just kind of have to hold on for dear life until you're at the bottom. It's kind of those sorts of things, and we go through those sorts of things in life all the time, and they don't always apply to sports. It could apply to relationships, right? Once you say something, there's no like taking that back. And we've all felt the effects of saying the wrong thing, and you're like, I wish those words would just like come back to me. But they're out there, and now I just have to deal with the consequences of what I said. And sometimes we make a choice that there's no going back on. Whether that is a dating relationship, maybe it's a work choice, quitting a job, changing a major, where you go to school. All of those things are large commitments, right? And they feel like oftentimes when we're making those things that those are like, that is the singular most important decision I'm ever gonna make in my life. Did you guys feel that way with like going to college? It just feels like this huge deal, right? That once I commit, I'm like committed. And those things happen all the time, and they happen in everybody's life. And today we're going to look at one of those crux moments in Jesus' life, where depending on what he decides, depending on what he does, determines the trajectory of so much in his life. And so we spend a lot of our time when we make those choices, we either live into the fruit of those good decisions, or we spend a lot of time and effort and energy trying to correct it, right? Like when you say the wrong thing to somebody that you care about, it's like a much longer period of time trying to correct what you just said and wished you didn't say. It's sort of like that. And so before we hop into it, I just want to kind of catch us up on where we're at in the story here in Luke. And before spring break, Paulina shared with us Jesus' entry into the city of Jerusalem. He rides in on a colt that the disciples have found for him, and the people are lining the roads and they're laying their coats down on the road as they go by him. And the disciples who had seen all of these miracles, who have heard all of these teachings in the crowd, they hail him as a king coming into Jerusalem. And we call that in the church calendar Palm Sunday. It's actually coming up just this coming Sunday, and it marks the beginning of the week of Easter. And so we looked at that and we saw how Jesus is perceived by the different people in the crowd, and how some people perceive him as a king, some people perceive him as a teacher, but they don't understand kind of the fullness of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And Jesus weeps over that, it tells us. He weeps over the city of Jerusalem that he has just entered. And now, since he has come into Jerusalem, we've had this moment, Paulina described it as kind of his superhero moment, where he comes in and it's a kind of announced for the first time of who he is. It's the same thing of like the old version of Superman, where he goes into the telephone booth and he comes out and he's dressed and flies off to save the world. It's this moment where Jesus is embracing this title for the first time. He's not keeping it quiet, and so he enters in to the city of Jerusalem, and it says that every day he goes into the temple and he teaches the people. And so he goes and he teaches, and then from there it says that he retreats every day up onto the Mount of Olives, and then he comes back down the following morning. And so we come to this time that's called the Passover, and this festival in the Jewish calendar. And Jesus has the disciples, and they go and they get a house. They go and they get a house for this Passover meal, and we see for the first time that Jesus institutes communion, like the Lord's Supper. And he goes on and he teaches them about who is greatest. And then after that, it says that he goes out and he goes, as was his custom, and he goes up onto the Mount of Olives. And that's where we're going to pick up the story today. But before we read this passage, I wanted to stop and I wanted to talk a little bit about what we were going to read today, because it's super important for us in understanding the life of Jesus. And it's Luke's scene of Jesus here in the Mount of Olives marks a critical point in the larger narrative for us. Because really, the consequences of this exact moment are so huge. The consequences are massive. Quite frankly, this is the deciding moment in the gospel story. Jesus has repeatedly told the disciples of the necessity of him suffering. And now that suffering is imminent. It's going to happen. And the question that drives the plot of this story is whether Jesus will continue along the path of submission to the Father. Will he continue to be obedient to God, or will he shun his preordained role and walk away? And that's the point of no return, where Jesus makes a decision that means everything for us, and it has meant everything for humanity ever since that decision was made. And it starts here in Luke chapter 22. We're going to start in verse 39 if you guys have your Bibles with you, or if you just want to open up your phone. And it says that he came out and he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And so Jesus is now leaving the house, that he's going up onto the Mount of Olives, as he does every day. Luke chapter 21 tells us that he goes every day up there. And the Mount of Olives is this ridge of 3 mountains that's out to the east of Jerusalem. And it's the middle peak is the Mount of Olives. And from up there, you can see down into the entire city of Jerusalem. So he's going up there. And so Luke paints this scene for us. And really what we see is that Jesus is the focal point of this story. The disciples are just following along behind him. They're like kind of puppy dogging, it's just like you're walking and the dog is following. That's kind of what's going on here. They're in the peripheral of the story. And so the scene is all about what Jesus is going to do. And it says in verse 40, when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed. And what's really interesting about Luke's version of this story is that he doesn't specify the place that this is taking place. Both, if you were to flip to Matthew or you were to flip to Mark, both of them specify that this is the Garden of Gethsemane. But Luke doesn't. And the other notable difference here is that although Jesus comes up onto the Mount of Olives, a big part of the narrative in both Mark and Matthew is Jesus withdrawing from the disciples, bringing with him Peter, James, and John, and giving instruction to them. He wants those 3 to specifically pray with him in this moment. And again, Luke doesn't point that out. He simply says that he went a stone's throw away. And that could mean a whole lot of things. Like it could be Uncle Rico's football throw, or it could be like me with my left hand, which could barely make it to Paulina. And so it's this ambiguous amount of distance, right? That doesn't matter to Luke in this narrative. And in this moment, we see that key narrative details in the other gospel accounts aren't present in this. And it's really interesting because for us as readers of the Bible, these 2 details, people and place, are 2 huge keys in terms of reading a story, right? And so we have to ask the question, why doesn't Luke include those? Why doesn't he care about the people, and why doesn't he care about the place? And so when we go back into this, we see the answer is what Luke places emphasis on. And the emphasis here in Luke's telling of this story is very specifically the theme of prayer. First, by Jesus' instructions to the disciples, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And now Jesus goes on to set an example, right? That he kneels down and he prays. And kneeling down and praying, that is a position of submission. That is a position of humility before God when we enter into that time of prayer. And so that's what Luke really wants us to clue in on, is this idea of prayer that's happening. And Jesus, it says, prayed in verse 42, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And if we're really paying attention to the language here in Jesus' prayer, it has echoes back to Jesus' temptation in the wilderness in Luke chapter 4. And what's really interesting about Jesus' temptation in the wilderness is that's the first time that he is tempted to not be obedient, to not do what God has called him to do. And so we see this language coming here to the forefront on the Mount of Olives, and this theme of obedience reaches a kind of a climax for us in this moment, with the opposing purposes of God and of the enemy here clashing at this moment, because Jesus has to choose whether he will be obedient. Knowing what is coming, will he do what he knows he's going to have to do? I was reading a scholar this week who pointed out that there's a certain sense of irony in this scene, since if Jesus embraces the cup in obedience to God's will, he will accept the fate willed for him by Satan, which is death. And only as the story unfolds does it become clear that Jesus' death represents not the greatest of the devil's achievements, but actually his demise. And so that's kind of the 30,000-foot view here of what's going on. We're seeing that there's this large-scale kind of battle of good and evil that looms over this exact moment. And so we turn to Jesus' prayer. And in this prayer, we see that Jesus does two things. He does two things, the first of which is that he points to God's sovereignty. He points to God's sovereignty, and he also indicates his willing obedience to God in this moment. Faced with the looming reality of his own death, Jesus asks that this cup will be taken from me. It's clear that he doesn't want to do it, but it's also clear that he's willing to be obedient in this moment. And what we need to recognize is that even in making this request, Jesus affirms his future is in God's hands, not his own. And so it's only if God does something, if God changes something, if God changes his plans, that Jesus will forego his ultimate suffering and death. But that is dependent upon God changing things and not Jesus. God's will and Jesus' submission to that will are the keys for us in Jesus' prayer. And this is the example that Jesus sets for us in our attitude, in our submission before God. And if you guys were to look over the course of history, this moment, this scene, this prayer has caused a lot of people to struggle for a lot of years. And they struggle because, quite frankly, this picture of Jesus isn't what they expect it to be. What they expect Jesus to be is the king that the people declared him to be as he came into the city of Jerusalem a week before this. What they expect him to be is the savior of the nation of Israel who goes and he conquers and throws out the Romans so that the Israelites have freedom. And yet we don't see this conquering, omniscient, all-powerful God. We see Jesus in all of his humanity struggling. That he knows what he's about to have to do and he doesn't want to do it. And so people say, what kind of God is that? And I look at this picture and I think that it is the most helpful picture for me in the Bible. Because I look at this picture and I see a God who struggled. A God who struggled with the same things that I struggle with. Who struggled with what it means to submit and to be obedient to a God that I sometimes don't understand. And oftentimes I don't want to do what he says. And so Jesus shows me what humble submission looks like. And it says that he prepared himself for his ultimate death by turning to God in prayer. And verse 43 says, and there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And this is another aspect that's really unique to the book of Luke. None of the other gospel accounts mention that there's an angel present in this moment. And there's this great temptation to get way off into the weeds in thinking about this angel, right? We could ask a million questions, we could think it into a million circles, but really what we need to be doing here when we read this is saying, why is the angel present? What is the purpose of the angel? Everything else is very secondary. So we see here that the purpose of the angel this is God's response to Jesus' prayer. It wasn't to remove the cup or to change his plan, but it was to give him strength in this moment. Strength for what he is about to have to endure. And that strength comes in the form of an angel, it tells us. And the result of that angel is that Jesus prays all the more fervently. He's praying so fervently that his sweat becomes like blood falling to the ground. And Luke goes out of his way here to portray Jesus' humanity in this moment. He is in agony about what he is about to experience. Jesus realizes the truly terrible thing he faces. But he is ready in this moment now to face death because of God's strengthening through the presence of the angel. And it says in verse 45, and when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Jesus rising from his time of prayer symbolizes the completion of his task. We see that when he rises, there's a level of determination, that there is a level of commitment, and he is certain of God's will for him, and he is also certain of what he is supposed to do in this moment. He has made his decision. And the disciples, at best, have been in the very peripheral of this entire scene up until this moment, and now Jesus brings them back to center stage. And their behavior stands in stark contrast, both to the instruction of Jesus, but also then Jesus' example that he sets for them. But we see that Jesus' response here is that of one of great grace. Because first, he excuses the disciples' behavior by attributing it to grief. He says that they were sleeping for sorrow. And the second thing here is that Jesus reminds them of their instructions to rise and pray that you may not fall into temptation. And so we must assume that their failure on the Mount of Olives was intended to be a teaching moment for the disciples. There isn't a hint, and we could read tone into this in a million different ways. When we look at this, it's a plain statement. There doesn't seem to be anger, there doesn't seem to be malice, there doesn't seem to be hurt in this, but he's saying, rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. And the disciples here fail to understand the gravity of this moment. How could they? Right? Their insensitivity to what is happening here stands in stark contrast to Jesus. And so the whole narrative we see is bookended by the same command, the command to pray that you might not enter into temptation. And we've asked this question a lot tonight, but we have to stop and we have to ask the question, why? Why is it at the beginning? Why is it at the end? There's something significant about it, right, if he's repeating it. And so we look at this, and why is the story structured in this way? And I think it's because Luke wants to do something unique here. One, he wants us to learn more about the person and the work of Jesus. But secondarily, he also wants to use this as a moment to instruct us. He wants to teach us. And he wants to teach us using Jesus' own words and Jesus' own example that prayer is the thing that keeps us from temptation and in line with God's will. And there are two things that I want to make sure that we notice when it comes to this story. Because it's an awfully short story. It's only 7 verses here. And the most important thing for us to realize is that Luke creates this scene so that we emphasize Jesus' obedience to God's will. Luke does this for us by creating the contrast, right? Numerous times he contrasts the disciples and Jesus. And we see the instruction that is repeated throughout. And so it draws us to the point that we see here that Jesus' submission to the will of the Father is radical. It is remarkable in and of itself. And the focus of Jesus' life, a life lived in harmony with God's divine plan for salvation, is inseparable from the death he anticipates. Even when he doesn't want to do it, he is committed to his role. And that commitment makes all the difference for us today. All the difference in the world. And so we have that like major theme here at the front for us, but we also have this theme of instruction, because Luke wants us to learn from this. And we see here that Luke intentionally employs this scene as a teaching tool. He teaches us that the way to remain obedient to God's will in times of trial is through persistent, heartfelt, submissive prayer. And this is evidenced by Jesus' own words to the disciples and the example he sets for them in this scene. And what's remarkable about this is that although the disciples very obviously fail to grasp the point here, if we were just kind of to flip back over to the book of Acts, we see that this exact concept begins to take root. Because we look at the story of the apostles in the book of Acts and we see their own willingness to submit themselves to the will of the Father, even to the point of death, as the church begins to grow and to spread, starting in Jerusalem and working its way out. And so why do we pray in times of trial? Because Jesus told us to do it. And Jesus himself did it. That's the bar, right? That's kind of the easy ones. When we look at the Bible and we say, like, what still applies to us today? Well, if Jesus said it and Jesus did it, that's a pretty good indication for us. And so we look at this and we say, okay, this is what we do. And so when we look at this crux moment in really the history of salvation, Jesus is the thing that takes center stage. He stands firmly in the middle. His mission here on earth becomes clear for us in this moment. And his resolve to be the sacrifice that is needed to pay the price for our sins. And everything else fades away. The disciples fade away. The angel fades away into the background. Even his impending suffering fades away. He alone stands here in the forefront for us to look at. He is our example. He is our teacher. And he is the one who has modeled what it means for us to live a life of faithful pursuit of God. And as we enter Holy Week this upcoming week, because Palm Sunday is on Sunday, and it all leads up to Good Friday, and then to Easter Sunday, I want us to take a moment and to reflect. To look at the scene here and look at the scenes that we're going to continue to look at over the next 9 days up until Easter Sunday, and realize that it's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. And to remember the sacrifice on our behalf. To remember the agony that he felt going into this experience. And to make this next week all about him. To focus our gaze on Jesus. To keep it at the front of our mind, because when we do that, we're more able to internalize the difference that it makes for us. And it makes all the difference for me, for you, and for the entire world. And that mobilizes us into a force that begins to model the life of Jesus into the communities around us. And that's how we see the gospel of Jesus Christ spread to be a force for change here. with our friends, with our families, in our classes, and ultimately here in this school.